Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. If you watch our nighttime show on the Fox News channel, you know who Victor Davis Hanson is. You've probably never seen somebody speak in that many continuous paragraphs without a single pause or One of the clearest thinkers we've ever met. One of our audience's favorite guests, one of ours. He's got a brand new book out, but we also thought we'd take this opportunity to ask him, who are you and where are you from? The book, by the way, is called The Dying Citizen, How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. Victor Davis Hanson joins us in studio now. Thank you so much. So, I would say anyone who watches Fox, particularly our show, knows you. But tell us how you got to where you are. Where are you from?
I grew up on a farm where I still live, halfway between Fresno, and you know it because you're a Californian, Visalia. Yes. And it was trees, nectarines, peaches, plums, grapes, and I grew up there working, and then I went away to school, undergraduate, and for some reason I majored in classics.
So, but this, just back to the farm, yeah. It's mostly fruit trees.
It was 180 acres, and I had two brothers, and we had between us 9 children, and a cousin, and we all lived there, and we had this idea we were going to be a family farm and perpetuate.
Whose farm is this? Is this something you bought?
It was no. It's been our family for 150 years. 1870. My great grandmother bought it, or bought it from the railroad.
Where were they from?
My maternal family were from Missouri. They were Northerners that got caught in the Civil War, and they came out on the Transcontinental Railroad right when it was built. After the war. And then my father's side had a farm nearby. He was Swedish. He came from there. My grandfather, they were all from Sweden, and they married. And so we thought we all had degrees, and so in our mid-20s we all thought my grandparents had passed away. My parents were working. We thought we're going to restore this the way they did in the 30s. And
yes.
Communal. We're going to have grow our own food, work alongside the laborers, and we did that for about 10 years, and then there was no money because of the crash in the 80s. The adjustment from inflation to deflation, it really destroyed farming. And so I had a PhD at Stanford, and I don't know why I was pruning for all those years. I was the butt of a lot of the jokes.
But you had a PhD from Stanford, but you were pruning for a living.
Yeah, I got a PhD when I was 26, and I came back and pruned and drove a tractor for 5 years. And I had 3 children, and we lived like we were back in the 19th century, and then suddenly
Did you like that life?
I loved it, but it really saved me because the people I had been in school with, in graduate school, that academic environment is toxic. It's not normal, and it's not rational, and it's obsequious. There were no people who were outspoken, so I wasn't working well within that. I did well in the school we are, but then when it came time to get a job, I didn't want to do it. But then after 5 years, I did both. So
I'm sorry, I have to ask, you were married?
Yes.
So did you tell your wife, I got a PhD from Stanford, but actually I'm going to prune trees now? What did she say?
She was from that area, so she thought he's come to his senses. and money doesn't really matter anyway. And her family was part of the Oklahoma diaspora, so they were
yes.
working people. And they thought this was great. And so we did it. And then all of a sudden, I didn't have health insurance. So I started a classics program. There was no classics at Cal State Fresno. I literally walked up, knocked on the door and said, I can teach Latin. And they said, you look like a hick. I had a gun in my car. I walked out and the police were on my truck. They said, you can't have a weapon. Because I was shooting, coyote, varmints. And so I started teaching there. And 20 years later, we had 5 professors in a classics program. It was and I was doing both, and then things got bad. The family kind of broke up. My parents died, and each person took a section and moved away, sold it and moved out, because the transformation to corporate farming. But I kept 40 acres, and then now I have almonds.
So it became impossible to support yourself on a small plot anymore.
Yeah, I mean, the raisin price was $1,400. It dropped to $400 in 1 year. Grapes were $25 a lug. They went down to $4. And
how much is a lug?
23 pounds. And so it was impossible unless you were vertically integrated. In other words, there were money to be made in the packing, the palletization, the cold storage, the shipping. But if you were just handing over your raw product, there was no way you could do it. And so now they're very efficient, and now that model is taken over, and all of these farms moved away. Their kids sold out, and then the illegal immigration changed the demography, and so we've got kind of a medieval corporate culture and kind of an immigrant culture. But it's very complex, so it's not, a binary of great people and evil people.
Right.
There's great people in the corporate world, there's evil people who are from Mexico, and there's good people. So I try to, I enjoy it much more because it has one thing in common. People are, they have to work and physical, and they're not idealists or utopians, and they mind their own business. Whereas where I'm at Stanford, it's all utopia, but nobody's ever subject to the consequences of their own
So the
ideology.
Spanish-speaking farm workers are not in your business. They're there to work.
They are. There's a second and third and fourth generation. One thing people I don't think understand about illegal immigration is the first and second generation in the 60s and 70s were from northern Mexico. And they tended to be better educated. They spoke Spanish. They spoke English more rapidly. And we were different than the host. We valued the melting pot of assimilation and integration. The next generations came with far more civil strife, the cartels, and they tended to be from Michoacan and
Yes.
Oaxaca, and they were more indigenous people. And they had a harder time to assimilate. And of course, we didn't ask anything of them as the host, as we did when I was growing up. I think there were 10 of us who were non-Hispanic, but we all had to speak perfect English. Our teacher would say, "Stand up, I have a stick shift Chevy." And we'd all say, "We have a stick shift Chevy." "No, you'll never succeed in life unless you speak the King's English."
So
All of that
10 in your class were non-Hispanic out of how many?
Yeah, and a local rural school.
Out of how many kids?
Probably 200.
Okay, so you grew up in a Latin world.
I didn't have any other friends until I got to high school. And on the other side of town, there were mostly there was mixed. But when I went to Eric White School. I think if you look at there today, it's 99% Hispanic. But when I was there, it was close to that. And those are my friends, but they're all successful. They're the police, they're the city councilmen, they're wonderful people.
But so you kind of hinted at something a second ago, which anyone who lives near Mexico knows, but I don't think most Americans understand. Mexico is a complicated country. It's not.
It is. It's a corrupt country, and people who are fleeing there, when you ask them, why are you giving up your homeland, they don't just say to make money, they say dignity. I talked to him, and I talked to a guy the other day, and I said, why did you leave Mexico? And he said, this is the first time somebody used the word senor when I went into the doctor. Mr. Lopez, Senor Lopez, and they don't treat us that way in Mexico. That's what people don't understand. That immigration, we don't have to listen to what the elites say. If you listen to the real people, they feel that this country gives people innate worth, regardless of their circumstances of their birth. That's what's wrong with most of the world. It's a tribal, aristocratic society, but this isn't. At least it wasn't. And so I think, I'm confident if we would just have legal, measured, meritocratic, and diverse immigration, it would work, as it always has with the Italians and people.
When you say diverse, what do you mean by that?
Well, we have 20,000, 34,000 from Mexico. We have some from Kenya. We have some from Finland. We have them, so that we don't get a tribal block where people do not see others that are unlike themselves.
So that is one of the big differences in our immigration scheme presently. It's overwhelmingly from one region, one language, one ethnicity, whereas before that, it was from Greece and France and Germany and Mexico.
Ted Kennedy in the 1960s, he changed the immigration law and led family reunification rather than meritocratic criteria. But that was a euphemism for change the demography to benefit the Democratic Party as the party of, the patron, and these were going to be the peasants, and they were going to be indentured, and they were going to show their fealty for expanded welfare. That's simplistic, but it's basically what happened. I'm confident it's going to change, though. We were starting to see that, weren't we, in 2018 and 19, a gradual reduction in illegal immigration, and then the powers of assimilation, I think, would have kicked in. We're starting to see more people from Asia, but I'm very pessimistic. 2 million scheduled in this fiscal year to come across the border. It's going to be a disaster.
How will that play out over time, do you think?
Well, it sure won't affect the people who engineered it. They will be in the bi-coastal elite enclaves, And their knowledge of people who speak Spanish will be Maria, the housekeeper, and Juan, the gardener, and they'll feel so good about themselves, but they will never put their kids in an integrated school or entertain or socialize with people from Mexico. I can see it in Palo Alto, where I work at Stanford. But in the long run, it's going to impact the Mexican-American lower and middle classes, because when you had these people from Central America, they go in, the first thing they do in the class, they'll say, "You're a gringo, you don't speak Spanish," to a third-generation Mexican-American kid. Or they'll have crime, or you will not have advanced placement courses because you'll have to return to the bilingual paradigm. And the people who pay that price are these local communities in California and the American Southwest that are mostly Mexican-American. They're progressing just, if I could be reductionist, along the trajectory of Italian Americans. That, if I say today Cuomo or Giuliani, you can't tell by the Italian name what their affiliation is, because they've assimilated. They were Catholic, Southern European, they came from Sicily and Southern Italy. It took longer. But basically, until this wave where we gave up on assimilation and controlled borders, they were starting to mimic the patterns of Italian Americans.
And you think that's changing?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a wide open border today. It reverberates through our whole society. So we're telling people, you must be vaccinated. I don't want to get into the science of that, but citizens are supposed to be vaccinated, but not 2 million people coming across the border unvetted, or 100,000 refugees are not going to be asked to be vaccinated, but the soldiers who escort them at risk to their lives have to be vaccinated. The vaccination's not the point. It's, why do we make it harder on a citizen than a non-citizen? That's what I'm just...
And what is I've noticed the same, and I see it on a bunch of different levels.
Yeah.
But it's always the same theme. We make it harder on the citizen than on the person.
I think it's partly a generic idea that the underdog, the left, always wants to romanticize somebody who's poor and coming here, and we're going to have different roles, sort of like affirmative action for immigrants. But there is a racial component to it. I think the left, in this kindy wokeness, anti-racist, you have to be racist if you're going to be an anti-racist. If we had European poor coming from Eastern Europe in droves, I think they would have no tolerance for them at all. So I do think there's an ethnic element. There's so many catalysts for illegal migration. Mexico wants the 60 billion that it shares with Central American remittances. They want a safety valve, march across the border, not on Mexico City when we're corrupt and we're racist, and they are racist compared to the way they treat their indigenous people. Then we have the La Raza.
Aggressively racist.
Absolutely. And then we have the La Raza movement that wants the changing demography. We have the Democratic Party that flipped California, Nevada, Colorado, they think Texas and Arizona. They've done Mexico. So they're a factor. And then we had the corporate world where, it really drove down wages. You hire somebody. And everybody said, well, yeah, but it's not that different when you pay somebody $6 or $8 in cash versus 10 or 12. But it was different because the hardest workers in the world are people from Oaxaca. They were desperately poor, and I've never seen people work that hard, at least the first generation.
Very hard.
Very hard. Wonderful people, hardworking, and exploited. And that was what was ironic about the Democratic Party, that they destroyed their old union base, or the lower middle classes of all tribes and races, because they bought into this open borders idea.
You're old enough to remember very well Cesar Chavez.
Yes. I grew up with him, Delano. I used to see him. He came to Selma, my hometown, all the time.
Head of the United Farm Workers Grape Pickers Union, famously boycott California grapes and he was I think it's fair to say, a savage opponent of illegal immigration.
He went down to the border and used force to stop people from coming across. And the word wetback, if you go back in the literature, and I can remember at rallies in Lincoln Park in Selma where people would say no wetbacks, because they call them wetback scabs.
Yeah.
They were very, and then the Teamsters sort of outsmarted them by pressuring both Republican and Democratic administrations to open the border to destroy the United Farm Workers. And then Chavez got into Synanon and a lot of weird things. And
he kind of went crazy at the end.
Yeah, he went crazy at the end, yeah.
Why would, this is kind of far afield, but I'm interested. Yeah. So the American labor movement led restriction to immigration for 100 years. Every restrictionist measure was a product of their lobbying, but then they decide they want to open the borders, which obviously hurts their members.
They wanted to, the Teamsters Union, they wanted to get all of the union into the Teamsters and certified established unions. And there was an ethnic chauvinism that this United Farm Workers was more than a labor union. It was a social, cultural, political movement. And the corporate world looked at that and thought, these guys are, you know, I guess they thought they were communists or socialists. So we're going to deal with the devil we know, the Teamsters. So they backed the Teamsters to break the United Farm Workers. But it wasn't hard to do when the Robert F. Kennedy Health Fund was corrupt and the Chavez's family had a whole octopus and tentacles all over the union. And so they kind of self-imploded. And but the corporate world would rather deal with the Teamsters any day than UFW. And then the whole union thing blew up, and now most of the labor is not unionized.
Even in California.
Yeah, the answer was mechanization. So
right.
We started with 100,000 acres of almonds, and we're at 1.2 million. And simple reason
The state of California.
Yeah, it's all mechanized. So you can do 40 acres of almonds with 2 people shaking, sweeping, and where you have 40 workers.
Almonds, or almonds,
yes,
as they call them, that was one of the few crops you needed hand picking, right?
Yes. Well, in the old days, in summers we would hit the almond trees with a mallet, and then we'd have canvases and pull it. It was very labor, but now it's all mechanized. So literally, you see these vertically integrated people. They have 10,000 acres of almonds, and they'll maybe have 1 employee per 40 acres. There's no hand labor at all, no pruning, no thinning. It's all mechanized. The irrigation, the fertilizer, the harvesting. And there's no labor. I mean, farm labor has decreased to such an extent that of all the illegal immigrants that come across the border, agriculture only accounts for 20% now. It's mostly meat packing, corporate hospitality, hotels, restaurants, landscaping, nannies.
So where you live in the Central Valley, there's an entire population came over to work on the farms.
Yes.
So what are people doing now?
I would say of the people who are legal now, 99% are the teachers, the city council people, the policemen, the firemen. And, you know, they're now, given 3 generations, as other immigrant groups, we have professors and doctors who are Mexican-American, absolutely. And the new generation's not following their focus in agriculture. They're going into construction. All the homes that are being built in Fresno County, or probably, I'd say, half of them are labor that's undocumented. And so agriculture is fading as a cultural phenomenon and a share of the labor market, but the export to China and India of these almonds and mechanized crops mean that in terms of actual cash, it's wealthier than it ever has been.
Yeah, that's the biggest agricultural export by dollars, right?
Yes, it is. And so it's kind of like a mosaic. You see these little tessers of 40, 60, 80 acre farms. They're aggregated either by lease or sale now into 5, 10, 15,000 acres. And they're very brilliant people that are doing it. So it's down to the nanosecond. So where we used to have 400 feet to turn, now they don't want to turn a machine because that little turn is uneconomical. So we'll have these half mile long rows, and it's all computerized, and they're the most efficient farmers in the world, and they're very lucrative. But all those little farmhouses are rented out to people from Mexico as affordable housing. So when I grew up, there were the Fanukis, the Italians, and the Israelis, the Armenians, and a lot of Japanese Americans. Very ethnic. It was a natural diversity.
Yeah.
And now it's all people from Mexico who are mostly not citizens, and they're living in their former farmhouses. And those former farmhouses are owned in large part by these vertically integrated corporations.
So that's why you described it as medieval.
I think it is medieval. I mean, there were good things about the medieval world. I'm not going to be...
There were.
Yeah, but... And so, in one hand, the agricultural production per acre, when I was farming, I couldn't farm like that. I mean, I'd do stupid things. If my grandfather had an alleyway with beautiful pecan trees, sort of shady, I would never tear it out. But it would get in the way, and it wasn't... So I did all that stuff that wasn't economical. And they were much better at it, and they were specialized, and they're very smart people. And then the laborers, you know, they're not as exploited as they used to be in an ironic way, because now they're driving air-conditioned machines, or they have bathrooms, and it's kind of ironic that all of the agendas of Cesar Chavez, that you have to have clean water and only certain hours regulated, he was a failure and he was a success because these big corporations have the capital and the public attention on them and there's so few agricultural laborers compared to 30 years ago.
What are the politics of the area like? How have they changed?
It's very funny because, as you remember, Prop 16 that was supposed to repeal the ban against affirmative action, it lost. And we still have a ban against affirmative action. And that was largely, I think, because of Latino second and third, fourth generation conservatives. So that Latino community, as they're integrated and intermarried, it intermarries more than any other community, they're getting very conservative. And they're about 30 to 40% of the electorate. And the term itself is becoming ossified because 1/4, 1/2. I mean, if you're Robert Lopez, you could have blonde hair. And
of course,
yeah, you could be Roberto, but you can be. My nephews, were half Mexican American, and they're completely assimilated. And it's been a wonderful transformation. But the elites keep trying to say, well, we have to have a Latino population, but to have that Latino, you have to have open borders. Close that border, and it'll be incidental that you're Mexican American. It is now, but when you get all of these people coming. And then they need advocates, they need lawyers, they need health care, they need subsidies.
Right.
They all live together, and they've got the cartels, the Norteños gang on one side of my farm and the Sureños on the other, and you put M13 in the mix. It's the frontier. It's 1870. I read my grandfather's diaries. I used to talk to him about his grandfather, and he said, somebody shot somebody in downtown Selma over water, and I'm thinking, they shoot them now all over the farm. We're going back to pre-civilizational. I can remember we got dog licenses in the 1950s. Everybody has to have a dog license. There's actually a guy that checks you. There's a guy that has mosquito abatement. He sprays every pot. All of this civilization came when I was growing up, and now we're reverting. So if I get bit, I don't know. I got bit a couple of times, and I just took my chances because there's no way I could trace that dog when there's 40 people from Mexico living in a compound in trailers around an old farmhouse. So I kept thinking, am I going to get rabies? But then I would call people, and they say, no, if your 5 people got rabies out of 40 million this year, take your chances. But it's kind of wild, you know what I'm saying? Keeps you on your toes.
What do two questions. Is there any chance the growing conservative Latino community you describe will end up voting Republican, A? And B, what do second and third generation Mexican Americans think of this new wave from southern Mexico?
Well, I've been talking, I think they think like I can't even use the word they as a distinct group anymore because they're so assimilated. But when they look at the border now, they don't see a Mexican-American America dichotomy. They see people from all over Central America, many people they have nothing in common with, and they look at that border and they say, my grandmother's on dialysis in Visalia, where are all these people going to crowd in front of her? My cousin is on disability, where are they? So they're on the front ranks of social services, they're going to be overwhelmed.
Yes.
They say, we have advanced placement now in our valley schools. What are we going to do when we have all these non-English speakers? Or why are we letting in people from Africa or Asia? So there's a lot of ethnic worries there as well, but they're not going to be for it. I think it's kind of analogous to the Cuban diaspora, where you have that second and third generation got more liberal. And I think that was a result of the universities. So there's a generation gap in the Latino community. As this new generation all goes to college, and we know what happens when you go to college, and their parents were in business, there's a friction there. So anybody over 30 tends to be very conservative. Anybody under 30 or 20 tends to be very liberal. And the university's changed. I taught 21 years at Cal State Fresno, and I had almost all Mexican American students. Some people that were poor whites from Oklahoma. But I can tell you that over that period, the university changed from 84 to 2004, 5 when I left. It became much more ideological, much less disinterested, more of a place that we have your kids for 4 years. Our job is to balance the prejudices of market capitalism, or religion, or your ancestry, and so we're here to be biased because they're all biased and it'll all work out, and that's how they justify that.
Would you, if you had young children, if you had, a house full of teenagers today, what would you do about their schooling?
Well, I had three.
Right.
I had a daughter who went to UC Santa Barbara and a son that went to Cal Poly and then Cal State Fresno. And we had these issues that we're talking about, they were affected, but what saved them was the same thing that saved me. And that is, on weekends they came home and we would say, get on the forklift or get on. So if my son was driving a forklift, he was 8 or 9 years old. I came home with a PhD at 26, and the first thing my father said to me, can you go wire the dehydrator? And I said, no. And he said, well, what the hell did you learn for 4 years? I said, well, I can write, I translated the San Francisco Chronicle into Greek. And so that I figured. And he wasn't an ignorant man. He was part of the Enlightenment. He was a college teacher. But he said, it doesn't do any good. I want you to go learn electricity, relearn it, and welding. And so, but that was good for our kids. They would come home and we would say, I'm so happy that you're going to the university, but you've got to be corrected and with hard work. My grandfather was very poor. He had just a 120-acre dirt farm, and he sent his daughters to Stanford University in the 1940s. He really believed in it, but they came home, and any ideas that they picked up were quickly adjudicated by farm laborers,
Well, how important do you think skills are for people?
I think they're absolutely essential. I think we're going to get to that, Tucker, very soon. I think when we have $1.7 trillion in aggregate student debt, and the majors that people borrowed money for, it's almost criminal. I mean, a used car salesman, not to be caricature used car salesman, but they wouldn't be able to get away with that contractual idea. Come to our university, we're going to raise the rate of inflation, we're going to raise tuition over inflation, oh, by the way, you're going to borrow 70, 80, 100, and we're going to give you a gender studies minor or sociology major, community studies, and you're not going to get a job, but we don't care. So we've got all these angry people who are delaying marriage, they're delaying first home buying, they're delaying child rearing. What Tocqueville was really worried about, prolonged adolescence in a democracy. And I think don't you think that's sort of the fodder of Antifa and BLM?
It's 100%.
Yeah.
And it's the rage of the professional class, which supports Antifa and BLM,
Yes.
is rooted in their dawning realization that they're screwed. They're not, you get some degree from the school and you think you're going to run the world, and you wind up as a, programs manager at some stupid nonprofit in Washington, and you're mad about that.
And I think these universities, I work at Stanford, but I don't think they have any idea where they are in this maelstrom. They think that they have a cattle brand, Princeton brand you. We don't care what you learn, but you're Princeton, you're set, you can go into Washington and get this cursus honorum. But I think what's happening is that online, but also schools like Hillsdale, homeschooling, a lot of people are saying we need an alternative paradigm. And these schools are increasingly losing their actual prestige because we're looking at the people who come out, and they're not taking philosophy, classical languages, French. They're taking these dash studies, leisure studies, environmental studies, peace studies, blacks, and they're not getting the classical writing, reasoning, inductive thinking skills, and employers know it. It's kind of like it's just sort of like the Wizard of Oz with these gears, and somebody's pulling the curtain out and they're saying, look, there's nothing there. They're obsessed with race. They don't care about class at all, and now they're picking people on the basis of their superficial appearance. And it's not proportional representation. We're looking at ethnic groups.
No, it's not proportional representation. That's for sure.
It's kind of reparations and admissions and hiring, and that's going to, if we're not going to train people, regardless of how they superficially look, in the basics of math and language and literature, etc., then when we put them in the university, they're not going to be competitive, and they're not going to be competitive, then they're going to have stereotype, they can't do the work, and then we're going to have the line that we see now where the faculty members are scared stiff to give them meritocratic grades because they will be targeted. So you can see where this is heading, and it's accelerating.
Right.
Somebody's going to have a rendezvous with a disaster in about 4 or 5 years.
Your book title is The Dying Citizen, How Progressive Elites, Tribalism, and Globalization Are Destroying the Idea of America. So the title, pretty evocative title. If you could sum up the theme of the book, and I have no doubt a lot of our viewers have already pre-ordered it, but how would you?
Well, it was, when we look at Afghanistan or the border or inflation or declining skills or the disunity, I thought, what is all this about? It's about the idea that an empowered, self-reliant citizen, which was the basis of Western constitutional government, started in Greece and Rome. There's nothing comparable in Egypt or the Near East or tribal Northern Europe, but it was based on a middle class, and it was based on a defined space so that people could say, these are our borders. In Greece, they even marked them with little stones. You know, we don't have any claims that we can spread our culture beyond that border. It's just beyond time and space for us. But within this, we're going to have traditions and customs and unify people that don't any longer have a tribal affinity. And tribalism then was considered backward, dangerous, because people would select somebody not on the basis of merit, but identity, similar identity. So I'm looking at these things, that this resurgence, end of the middle class, the end of the border, or the destruction of borders, and the destruction of meritocracies in favor of tribalism. But then at the same time, there's a postmodern, more elite, bicoastal effort to destroy citizenship. And you can see it with this growth of this 2 or 3 million person administrative state. So where did James Comey come from? Why does he say, I don't remember 245 times? Why does James Clapper lie under oath once and John Brennan twice? Why does Robert Mueller, the basis of his whole investigation was a Steele dossier and Fusion GPS? He has no idea. He says, under oath. And then we have Lois Lerner. So we have these judge, jury, and executioner, legislative, judicial, executive branch, unaccountable, Versailles, El Escorial, Byzantium, these bureaucracies. And we have no way of challenging them. They have the force and the money and the influence of government. Then we also have these evolutionaries. Let's get rid of the 150-year 9-person Supreme Court. Let's get rid of the 180-year filibuster. How about the 232-year Electoral College? Let's get rid of 60 years of 50 states. Oh, if you're going to do that, let's get rid of the idea that states should set their own voting laws, because they don't give you equity or an equality result, which the founders were scared of. And then finally, a very ancient idea, Tucker, this Greek word cosmopolitanism, citizens of the world, so that all of our politicians now say, I'm a citizen of the world. And that means what? That Tony Blinken's going to ask the UN to come in and look for racism, given the UN Commission on Human Rights? Or the International Criminal Court's going to adjudicate our behavior and say nothing about China or what Russia does? So that utopianism, whether it was the League of Nations or the Fabian, it's never worked. So what I'm trying to do is just tell everybody you're not crazy, that these things have an ancient pedigree. And we were lucky to have that formula of middle class, secure borders, integration, assimilation, no tribalism. You know, your first allegiance was to the idea of the Constitution. And we had elites that had a sense of public service, and they were balanced. And we were very skeptical of large government, and we surely did not trust the aggregate wisdom of China or the Europe in our history. And yet that's all eroding, and I think that explains a lot why we as citizens feel sometimes that people who are mere residents or illegal residents have as much or more influence than we do. And we're not economically viable, the middle class, like we used to be. And people are looking at each other in weird ways, as if I'm going to prove that I'm 1/8 or 1/6, and I'm more of a victim than you are. No, I'm the oppressor. No, you're the oppressed. It's just.
When I was a kid, that was considered Nazi stuff. Like the idea that your bloodline was
blood and soil. Remember, blood and soil.
Of course, but there was a huge taboo around that. You know, your DNA determines your life. Isn't that's Nazi stuff? That's what people said.
There was something called the German problem. About every 30 years, some crackpot, whether it was Hegel or Nietzsche, said, you know, Rome never got beyond the Danube or the Rhine. We're the only country that you can speak German and you can live in Germany, but you're not German because you're pure.
Right.
You were not Mongolized by Rome. And so we're going back to this, I am 1/16th, I am a minority, it's sort of like the Neo-Confederate one drop, or maybe we're going to have it's absurd too. You know, in Western Europe, when Hitler wanted everybody, the Nazis, to wear a yellow badge, a lot of Nazis wrote in their diaries, we're kind of worried about this, because if we have to have a badge, because people don't talk any differently, and they don't look any differently, and they don't act any different, maybe this thing is nuts. And in Western Europe, and so if you can't tell what a person is, and you have to go to your DNA, and I'm not exaggerating. Remember, Elizabeth Warren wanted to prove
Yes.
it. And so that's where we're headed. And you know, you talk to people in universities, and there's kids that will say, I am 1/4 or I'm 1/6, and they will take DNA tests if challenged on it. And what does it mean? I mean, we're the only multiracial country in the world that's ever worked a constitutional system. I mean, the ones that were multiracial were imperial, the Ottomans or the Soviets, and they had to kill people. India's trying it in Brazil, and they're not doing a very good job. Why would we throw that away in the 21st century?
So what's the answer? Why would we throw that away?
I think part of it is that and this is kind of esoteric, I don't want to get into the weeds, but we created an elite bi-coastal global culture with more wealth, $5 trillion of market capitalization, Silicon Valley, and we gave them enormous power, and they control the corporate boardroom, Wall Street, K through 12, universities, Hollywood, entertainment, professional sports, social, and they have a degree of power and influence to affect the way people think I've never seen before. And they are medieval in the sense that they find penance by abstractly being left-wing, or abstractly, if I'm Mark Zuckerberg, I'm going to put $500 million in these select precincts in the election, and that's going to make me feel really good about it. But when you look at their actual lives, they don't live any differently than the people at Versailles did. They're elitists, they're wealthy, they're sort of segregationists. They don't want their prep schools are. You look at Silicon Valley, there's more prep schools than there were in the South that popped up during the Civil Rights Movement. Remember when the integration started?
Of course.
Well, that's what's happening now in Northern California. All the people that love teachers' unions and they want to have higher taxes, they don't want to put their kids in those schools. So I think that's warped everything, because those ideas that reflect their own insecurities and guilt and abstract penance or atonement, we're the beneficiaries of that, or the victims, I should say. And it's really permeates. We don't want to have any dams, that's unnatural, but we want hetchy on the coast. We want you to pay 27 cents a kilowatt so we can save the planet, but it's 70 degrees over here in San Francisco, so we don't have air conditioning or heating. We don't think you guys in Fresno should have cheap gas, but we don't drive. We want you to have high-speed rail. Try it out down there, but not here. So a lot of California dichotomy is this group is never subject, as I said, to the consequences of these crackpot ideas because of money and influence. Shield them, and that's scary because California tends to be, as Mike Bloomberg said, remember, this is the model for us all.
Of course.
And I think it is. We're both Californians. We see how insidious that state is.
It's now poisoning a lot of the West, I would say. I hate to say that.
It's sort of like the sirens in the Odyssey, you know, because it's so beautiful, and
Yes.
people are so casual that it allures people and think, wow, I want to go to California.
Are you going to stay?
I'm 68. I just turned 68 this week. And if I was 30, I'd probably leave. But then I'm in the same house that was 150 years, and my parents were dying. They said, I don't know what to tell you, Victor, but would you please keep the house? And so I don't know if my children want to live there or not. But it's in great shape. I work on it all the time. And it's kind of like a museum for me. So I don't want to be the first to give it up. But I walk in rooms, and it's just kind of crazy. I hear my aunt. She was crippled. She lived in the living room for 65 years. I see where my grandpa...
She lived in the living room for 65 years?
Yes, because nobody had, you didn't put people when they had polio. She had crippled with terrible polio, and she couldn't go anywhere. And I remember talking to her, and I see my grandmother, I'd go out...
Wait, so you grew up and your aunt was living in the living room?
Yes. I mean, we had a little house next to them, and then when they passed away, I moved in there. But I visit her every day. We were free range, we were like 6, and they'd just say, go out. And we'd roam all over 130 acres, and my grandparents had a house, we had a house. Neighbors would take care of us. It was idyllic, but I thought I could recreate that artificially in the 1980s. So when I came back, I thought my kids are going to be free range. I'm going to
Yeah.
put them in the public schools just like I did. I'm going to teach them all these skills. And then I realized people thought they were crazy because, you know, they'd say, your children are going to those schools? You went to Stanford? But they're very great kids. And they say to me now, you know, thank you, because all their friends are multiracial and they got practical skills. My son was a great forklift driver, and he worked once for Orchards, I think it was Orchard Supply or Home Depot, and the truck came in, and nobody was there to unload it, so he wasn't a certified forklift driver, you know, with a little costume on and everything, so he just jumped on and just unloaded it really quick, and they fired him.
For unloading a truck?
Yes, because he was unauthorized and he didn't have the authorized skill from that particular store, and he was a masterful truck driver. He'd been doing it since he was 8. So he came back to me and he said, they got angry at me, and I said, congratulations, I'm really proud of you. I mean, that's really good. So those skills, I was very proud that they had those, and we're very close. I'm very close to my 2 children. Yeah. I had a daughter that passed away, and she was the same way. She was just so practical, and she grew up picking tomatoes and everything. So we tried to recreate that artificially, but I'm not sure it was the same, because it was so fun for us. It was hard work, but this was in a bubble.
The life you described trying to create does seem like an ideal. I mean, that sounds wonderful.
It does. And I worry now when I'm 60, I said, did I put my kids through, you know, kind of an ordeal to prove a point that they could still be agrarians and have a family farm? And then we grew up really poorer than I did, because farming was worth. And at some point I just said to myself, they have no health insurance. I like to straighten their teeth maybe. I've got to go back and join the system. So I cleaned up my act and became...
You raised your kids poorer than you were.
Yeah. So we were called regressives, that we were leaving the middle class and becoming peasants. And then I became a Greek professor.
What were your politics like at this time?
My parents were, my mother had gone to Stanford. She was I guess you'd call him Pat Brown. Remember Pat Brown?
Very well. Jerry Brown's father.
Yeah, can-do Democrats after the war. Every little town, you know, there was the wealthy guy was the undertaker, the big car dealer. It was this 90% tax rate, and there was no mobility, and they were all Republicans, and everybody else was Democrats. And then, so my parents, it seems crazy, but they were very socially and culturally conservative. No drinking, you know, if you go to a party, you have to shake their hands, you have to lift them on the eye, Victor. My mom would pick us up from, did you say thank you to the host? I said, I did. No, you didn't. Get back there. But they were also, in those days, you could be Democratic. Democratic Party was different. But my siblings are all very much more liberal than I am. So,
still?
Yes, I'm the black sheep of the family.
Interesting. So when you graduate Stanford with this doctorate in classics and decide to go back to pruning fruit trees, did you have a political ideology at this point?
I was conservative from a young age. I told my mom I could not vote for Jimmy Carter when and I liked him, but I just couldn't vote for him. And she got kind of upset about that because it's Democrat. He was a Southern Democrat in those days, not quite like she thought like this. But biggest problem I had was economic. I wrote a book about Fields Without Dreams. I thought that it was wrong that you gave your product and you worked so hard, and yet you had to be vertically integrated, and that required connections with government and capital.
Totally.
And I started to have a populist streak. I always had, but that made it much so. When the Trump MAGA thing came along, I was receptive to that. The idea that we're going to go back and look at these hardworking people that we've written off as losers, deplorables, Trump's people that Biden called chumps or dregs. And I really identified with them because I'd grown up with them. And so for me, it wasn't so much Donald Trump the person, but it was what he represented. And I couldn't figure out why all these Republican candidates in 2016 didn't say, why are we giving China all of these trade advantages? Why are we opening our border? These wars that I supported, the Iraq War and but they were not in a cost to benefit or moral sense working out for the people that were fighting them. And so I couldn't understand the Never Trump movement because I thought everybody wanted to help the middle class and conservatives, but I realized that the Republican Party was one of what I had grown up with. My father had said to me, I like Republicans, you just remember, Victor, they have a certain class and they have a certain view of you. And I had kind of returned to that, even though I don't vote Democratic. But I'm not comfortable with very wealthy country club Republicans. And that's a stereotype, it's unfair, I realize that.
I don't think it's unfair at all.
You don't? Yeah, well,
no, I grew up in that world, so I can tell you it's not unfair at all. I used to think it was unfair, defensively, but now I realize, no, it's complete. Oh, yeah, it's absolutely true. Well, stereotypes are rooted in some truth, or they wouldn't have evolved, of course. But did that affect? But by the time Trump came around, you were an established, famous. I mean, I've read you for a long time in National Review.
Yeah. I don't know if I was famous, but...
Well, you're famous among I don't know, conservative intellectuals, for sure.
Yeah.
And you wrote one of my favorite pieces I've ever read on the changes to the Central Valley. So people knew who you were paying attention. Did it affect your friendships? Did you lose friends over? Because you were an early adapter or adopter, or whatever the phrase is.
Yeah, I didn't know much about Donald Trump. I wasn't a supporter of his in the primaries, but I knew he was going to win. I just knew it. Because he was saying things that I could not believe. And, you know, we're going to redo Youngstown, Ohio. And then he came to California. I talked to a bunch of farmers, and I said, well, did he come here? And did he have the straw in the mouth and the caterpillar cap? And did he have hay? No. He had this black suit. It was 105 degrees. And he had a Queen's Act. So I said, in other words, he wasn't Hillary Clinton, you know, or Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Put you all in chains. He didn't change his act. I said, he's authentic. And he's representing the middle class, so I thought he had a very good chance. But as far as your other question, yeah, I lost all of those friends.
Really?
I left National Review this year after 20 years, and I think they were happy to see me leave too. And
why did you leave National Review?
Because there were certain issues that would pop up occasionally, and I could predict what the answer was going to be. The Covington kids, I just sensed that before we knew anything, people would come and condemn them, or the Access Hollywood.
People at National Review condemned
because
the
I think there were certain people in the Republican movement or establishment who felt it's their duty to internally police their own, and that's kind of a virtue signal to the left. We are just part of your class. We share the same values as you do, and we keep our crazies, and they're not empirical. You saw it on January 6th. I mean, we all condemned that buffoonish riot, but within 2 weeks, I said to myself, Ashley Babbitt was shot unarmed, and we don't know anything about the policeman. We don't know anything about the report. When a policeman shoots somebody who's unarmed, there's pictures everywhere.
Yeah, there's no warning, by the way.
And then I thought, they're having Officer Sicknick lie in state, but I want to know where the evidence is that he was killed. He wasn't killed. He died of a stroke or some type of...
So National Review wasn't on that, huh?
No. And then there wasn't armed insurrection. There were no weapons found on the people who were arrested. They're not even being charged and tried with dispatch. They're sitting in purgatory. And so these issues I would get angry about, and I try to convey that anger, but I think they felt that I can't say they all, but I think a lot of them felt it was their duty as Republican establishmentarians to tell the world they didn't approve of Donald Trump's tweets or his crudity, and that was my message was always, but it's good for the middle class.
Yeah.
And he's kind of like a Shane or Magnificent Seven or High Noon. He's a gunslinger we hired, and we're the townspeople that are impotent, and he came in with certain skills, and he started to have success, and now we have the luxury of saying we don't like the fact that he has a 6-gun. Right. And then but he's not ridden, you know, he has to ride off in the sunset. But they didn't, there were other issues I think that they felt were more important, and so I think it was a good parting for both of us. And so,
what issues do they think are important?
I don't know. I think there's an image that a lot of Republicans have, both in politics, and they sort of represent a sober and judicious way of looking at the world, and we're the adults in the room. And it's more about a culture than it is an ideology. And the original Republican conservative movement, I thought, was going to be, we're going to go back and look at the Constitution when Jefferson said, it won't work if you pile up everybody in the cities because they'll be subject to mass hysterias, or you look at Tocqueville and certain ideas. I thought that's what we were, and I thought they would be champions of the middle class, but I don't think they were. I don't think they wanted to be.
There's been this very odd phenomenon, which I've never really figured out, where there were fairly well-established Republican figures. I could name them. I know them all. I won't. But you know who they are, and I think our audience knows. I'll just say David Frum or David French, or
I've met them all. I've met all.
Yeah, not super impressive people, but well-known Republicans who didn't like Trump, which I always understood.
Yep.
He's a bore, whatever. He's loud. He's imprecise. Got it. But then they basically became kind of ferocious lifestyle liberals, tools of the left. They really did.
They did.
And in the case of Frum, who I will say I know well, is a smart guy. But he's writing some piece about actually we do need to take your guns away, and vaccine mandates are important, and why don't we just kill people who disagree with us, or whatever. Like, how did that happen?
I think two things. I think because of Donald Trump's background, his accent, his methodology, they were faced with a dilemma. They said, yes, in the abstract, he's going to be a better conveyor of our conservative beliefs than the alternative, Hillary or Biden. But if I endorse him, then I become responsible culturally, socially, for everything about him. And I don't want to be attacked by all the people that I value, even if they're left. It's not so much a political metric, but it's a cultural. These people went to Harvard, these people went to Stanford, these people went to Berkeley, they live in a good zip code, that kind of old boy network. And they thought, if you're going to be for Donald Trump, and you look at those rallies out in Michigan, or you look at those rallies in Alabama or the San Joaquin Valley, those are your people now. And we don't want to be around with those people. Look at you, that's who you're going to be with. And then the other thing is they live in abstractions. For them, there's no consequences. They've got pretty good jobs, they have nice homes, some of them have good money. But a lot of people, the world is 51%. When I was farming a plum orchard, if I said to myself, I didn't thin it right, I didn't fertilize it right, but if I got that crop in, it was good enough. And for me, I just took every issue with Donald Trump, Hillary, Donald Trump, Biden, and I said, that's good enough for me. Because it was better than the alternative, and you don't have to be perfect.
But how could you go from, spend 20, 30, 35 years defending a certain worldview, and then in the space of 4 years become, exactly the opposite?
That's a good question, because that suggests that maybe they always were where they wanted to end up, and they were uncomfortable, and they were just sort of, well, we're going into this game, and these guys are there, and there's more chances over here, so we'll split up, but we're more alike than different. And now they found out, well, there's not two teams now, and it's not just an old boys club, and it's not, John McCain running against Barack Obama or Mitt Romney or the Bushes. Now it's the guys in Youngstown, Ohio versus the guys in Manhattan, or the guys out in Bakersfield versus, the guys in Westchester. And they thought, I don't want to be on that side. Because you're right, if you look at the actual issues, there's no defense of anything they said, because they gave us the worst 8 months in my memory of administration. It's lunatic, and yet in some ways they're responsible, because in very close 45,000 votes.
Yeah.
So everybody said the never Trumpers don't matter, and they didn't, because 92% of Republicans voted. But in this election, when you had 45,000 votes, could have changed the Electoral College. I have a feeling those 45 votes were independent people who would be influenced.
Of course. And so these are smart. I mean, some of these people, I hate to admit it, are they're smart.
And they're silent now.
They're capable. No, but I mean that some of the never Trumper types.
Yes, and they're silent about the wages of what they wrought, aren't they?
It's beyond belief.
Yeah, it is. I see these people and I think, wait a minute. You told a whole generation of young conservatives, whether you're Bill Kristol or, as you said, David Frum, this is what you got to do, and they did it. Or I was listening to George Bush's speech the other day on 9/11, and I thought to myself, They called you Hitler, they called you Mussolini, they called you a Nazi, they made fun of your family, and all of us thought that was terrible, and now here you're comparing the people who were in that buffoonish riot with the people who slaughtered 3,000 Americans. How can you do that? These people are not murderers, they're not Islamic terrorists, and yet why are you doing that?
I know.
And that's what's
and it is a reckoning for a lot of us. I mean, I knew Bush pretty well, and I'm never that impressed, but I didn't think he was evil or anything,
no, he's a
and
good
I
man.
certainly defended him. But that behavior is so loathsome. To say something like that about American citizens
I know.
is so
even if and somebody said, well, maybe he meant BLM, it would be loathsome to say that about BLM.
I completely agree. These are your countrymen. Like, what are you talking about?
We're all American. I couldn't believe it. And then on the idea of unity. And I guess all of these people, at some point in their life, given their values or their upbringing or their circumstances, they feel that I have a rendezvous with a deal to make. I've got to make sure that I'm right with the right people. These are the people, the New York Times, PBS, or Harvard, or Yale, the establishment. And if you go against them, it's going to be a miserable life. And they all make deals. Romney made a deal. Remember they said that he put his animals on the car, he had an elevator, he didn't talk to his black garbage collector. They just were vicious, and yet he's now one with them again. And I think that's what's really scary about this, because it kind of proves a lot of people who've been telling us. And I was very skeptical, say, of the Rand Pauls of the world. When I saw Rand Paul interrogate Dr. Fauci, I said, that guy is absolutely right. And there's not very many things he says that I disagree with now.
No, he's brave too.
Yeah, he's brave. And
I got to ask you, after we're an hour in.
Yep.
Final question, but I was thinking, is listening to you talk, the category of working class intellectual, that was a thing in the country once upon a time.
Yeah, it was.
And you're maybe the only one I know left.
Well, there's a lot. I have a colleague at Cal State Fresno, Bruce Thornton, and he grew up on a cattle ranch, and he'd always tell me, these farmers are lazy, you don't know how to run, So we were both middle class or agrarians, and he was cattle. So there are people out there, but it's too schizophrenic, because all of the skills that are admired on a farm, or that you're direct, that you stick up for somebody, that you don't talk about, you just do it. When you get into the academic or the established, those are drawbacks. So for me, sometimes I felt like I was splitting in two. I would get off the tractor and I'd go to work, and somebody would say, wow, you did a great job with, you disc 5 acres in an hour, or you fixed the disc blade really well. And I'd go there, and I would be in a faculty lounge and arguing for 2 hours over $20 of travel money. And one could say, and of course one could postulate, so that idea of academic abstraction it's ultimately, we all know what's happened in the late 20th and 21st century. We were very affluent and leisured society, and we lost the fundamental lessons from our ancestors, and we created this leisured elite that's totally divorced from nature. Ask them what phase, they don't know anything about nature, and they don't know anything about the lower classes or the muscular classes, and yet we deify them and we worship them. And at some point in our lives, you just have to say, not this pig, I'm not going to do it. And if you do that, it's liberating, but it's also it can be bizarre.
It's wonderful.
Yes, it is.
You're a brave man, and this hour has explained why you're our viewers' favorite. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Tucker.
Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you.